Pee-wee Gaskins. Even the nickname sends chills down your spine.
It does, doesn't it? You think of rural South Carolina, a place you might imagine as peaceful.
Right. Friendly people, that classic Southern hospitality. And yet, this name, this figure, emerges from those peaceful back roads.
It really makes you think about those dark undercurrents, the things lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today, a deep dive into the life and crimes of Donald Henry Gaskins, a man who confessed to a string of murders that just terrorized the South. For decades, really.
It's a story that captures the imagination, doesn't it? That contrast, the idyllic image of the South, juxtaposed with this brutal reality.
Absolutely. And we're going deep. We've got court documents, newspaper articles.
Or even his autobiography.
Which, let's be honest, is probably full of embellishments.
Right. You have to take it with a grain of salt. Trying to sift through what's true, what's self-serving, it's part of the challenge. And what makes it so intriguing.
It's like a puzzle, where some of the pieces are meant to mislead you. But we got to start somewhere. And he claimed over 100 victims. It's almost too much to grasp, you know.
Well, let's start at the beginning. His childhood. Gaskins was born into poverty. Neglect. You can't underestimate the impact of those early years.
I've read about it, but just hearing you say it, it's difficult to really understand what that means for a child.
Think about this. According to the Lynch's Lake Historical Society and Museum, Gaskins didn't even know his real name until he was a teenager, standing in a courtroom. That's when he heard it for the first time.
No, I can't imagine. That's just awful. It makes you wonder if he ever stood a chance.
The age-old question, nature versus nurture. How much do our experiences make us who we are?
And in his case, those experiences were brutal. I mean, he was committing violent crimes very young. As a teenager, he and two other boys formed a gang. They called themselves the Trouble Trio.
You see this escalation of violence often with these kinds of cases. Desensitization. It starts small, but the more they inflict pain, the less impact it seems to have on them.
They were involved in burglaries, assaults. There's even a horrific account of them gang raping a friend's sister.
It's a chilling reminder that the path to these horrific acts often begins in the seemingly mundane, in acts that might be dismissed as youthful indiscretion, but those acts lay the foundation for something far more sinister.
It's true. And he ended up in reform school at 13 for attacking a girl with a hatchet. Seems like he was already headed down a very dark path.
And that path led him straight to prison. Your mention of the court documents, those paint a stark picture of his life behind bars. He was both victim and perpetrator.
The thought of prison as a breeding ground for a future serial killer, it's terrifying.
It's a sad reality in many cases. The same article I mentioned before from the Lynch's Lake Historical Society and Museum talks about Gaskins being raped by other inmates, repeatedly. And he said later that the only way to survive was to become even more violent, more ruthless.
It's like a twisted self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? You go in vulnerable, and the system hardens you, almost guaranteeing that you'll come out worse.
Exactly. And he ends up killing an inmate, Hazel Brazel. He said it was about gaining respect, power. But even with this murder, there are conflicting accounts. Some say he acted alone, others claim he had help.
So the manipulation, the weaving of narratives, it starts early. But let's talk about what happens when he gets out.
He gets out, and he gets married. To Mary. But hold on, there's more. He escapes while incarcerated and marries another woman, Junie Alice Holden. Chaos seemed to follow this man wherever he went.
Breaking every rule.
Yeah.
Pushing every boundary. And the article says he actually had a period of stability after that second release.
Yeah.
He even held down a job for a bit. Like he was almost trying to blend in, be normal.
Right, you almost think maybe there's hope, but then it all spirals.
The darkness was just waiting. This is when the coastal killings begin, and it goes on for years. Dozens of victims.
It takes on a whole new dimension. It's not about prison survival anymore. This is something else entirely. Calculated, chilling.
And that's where we'll pick up next time.
And the brutality. It escalates. It's not just about taking a life. It's about
inflicting pain, terror.
Exactly. One case that really stands out, the murders of Doreen Hope Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter, Robin Michelle Dempsey.
God, that one. It's just horrific. Not only does he kill the mother, but a toddler.
It's described in detail in the Donald Pee-wee Gaskins, Rapist, Cannibal, and Serial Killer's Investigation Discovery article, the sexual assault, the murder. And then he eats part of Doreen's leg.
I mean, it's almost beyond comprehension to go to that level.
It speaks to a level of depravity, really. That's hard to wrap your head around.
It is, but we have to remember, he was human, not some, boogeyman, shaped by his experiences.
Right, and that's the unsettling part. This capacity for evil, it exists within all of us, potentially. And these factors, these terrible experiences, abuse, neglect, exposure to violence, they can all play a role.
I think about the article Peely Gaskins, the prospect of a wee man Lynch's Lake Historical Society and Museum, and how it explores the link between trauma and criminal behavior. It's fascinating, but it's also terrifying to think those early years can have such an impact.
They really can. It makes you think about free will. How much control do we really have over our own destinies?
And it's not like he was just passive, right? He was dishing out that violence at a very young age, too.
That's a key point. It's not just that he was abused. He seemed to embrace violence, find some kind of twisted satisfaction in it.
Which always brings us back to nature versus nurture. Was he predisposed to it, or did his environment create it?
It's the question, isn't it? And in his case, I think it was probably a combination of both.
You mentioned earlier that he claimed over 100 victims, but a lot of experts dispute that number.
They do. The article Peely Gaskins and the Subjectivity of History Office of the Vice President for Research University of South Carolina points out the discrepancies, especially when you compare his autobiography, which was self-serving, with more reliable sources.
Right. It seems like he enjoyed exaggerating. Maybe to build up his notoriety.
Exactly. To control the narrative. He wanted to shape how people saw him. Power and control were huge factors in all of this.
Not just over the narrative, but over his victims, too.
Absolutely. He would prolong their suffering, almost savor their fear.
God, it's just chilling. It's like he wasn't just taking their lives. He was taking away their humanity, reducing them to objects.
Dehumanization. It's a key part of understanding his crimes, and it's something we have to be really careful about, the way we think about and treat other people.
We can't lose sight of the victims, their families, the impact these crimes had. These were real people with lives, loves, dreams, all cut short.
And the trauma, it goes beyond the immediate victims. It ripples outward. Families, communities, whole generations scarred by this.
I keep thinking about that article, Peely Gaskins, the prospect of a wee man Lynch's Lake Historical Society and Museum, and how it talks about that atmosphere of fear, suspicion, people afraid to trust anyone, afraid to let their kids play outside.
And that fear, it lingered long after Gaskins was caught.
The wounds of violence run deep. It takes time to heal, and some would say, you never truly heal.
And that's why it's so important to provide support to those who have been affected by violence, help them heal, rebuild.
We can't just lock up the perpetrators and forget about everyone else. We have a responsibility to those left behind, to help them recover and to work towards preventing this from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And that means addressing the underlying causes too. Poverty, lack of opportunity.
It's a complex problem, and it needs a complex solution.
It does. But we have to try to learn from the past and to work towards a better future.
And he was caught. It's worth noting that it wasn't some brilliant detective work or anything.
Right. Why Donald Peely Gaskins got the death penalty, WLTX.com goes into the details. His final arrest was because he confided in an associate about the murders. He even showed him where he'd buried the bodies.
He was so meticulous before, so good at covering his tracks. And then, this carelessness.
Arrogance, maybe. He thought he was untouchable. Smarter than everyone else.
And that arrogance led to his downfall.
But his story doesn't end there. He was already serving multiple life sentences, but it was the murder of another inmate, Rudolph Tyner, that landed him on death row.
I read about that. 40 years ago, SE killer Peely Gaskins murdered fellow inmate the State. It's hard to believe that someone facing life in prison would even...
It's almost like he couldn't stop. No remorse, no understanding of the value of human life.
And the way he did it. Building a bomb from smuggled materials.
Cunning. Resourceful. Even in prison, he was manipulating his environment.
And like he thrived on that chaos.
And State v. Gaskins, 1985, South Carolina Supreme Court decision, South Carolina case law, South Carolina law, U.S. law to Justia, talks about how he tried to deflect blame, even as the evidence piled up against him.
Always working the angles.
A master manipulator. And in the end, the very tools he used to manipulate people led to his downfall.
His recorded phone conversations. Yeah. They became evidence against him.
It's ironic he couldn't control the narrative forever.
The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how clever you think you are.
It does. And that truth, in his case, it's a dark and disturbing one.
It is. But it's a story we need to tell, to understand, to learn from.
And to remember the victims, the families, the community that was forever changed.
and to work towards a future where these kinds of horrors
Hmm.
are just stories, not realities. You know, it's a really heavy story, one that sticks with you. And as we've been talking about, he wasn't some mythical monster. He was real. A man shaped by his environment, shaped by, I don't know, forces beyond his control maybe. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we try to understand this case.
It is. And in true crime, we always want to focus on the sensational, the monstrous. But it's easy to forget that these were real people, real lives, shaped by real circumstances.
Absolutely. And with Gaskins, it's especially disturbing because the article, Pee Wee Gaskins, The Prospect of a Wee Man, Lynch's Lake Historical Society Museum, it talks about how he used his charm to disarm people. Like he'd offer them rides or help with car troubles. He seemed harmless.
Predators do that, don't they? They prey on our good nature, our willingness to help.
Right. And can you imagine you're in trouble and someone stops to help?
Yeah.
You might have this feeling, this unease, but you dismiss it. Because who could imagine that this seemingly nice person would actually be capable of such evil?
It's scary to think about. It reminds you to trust your gut, be aware, and if someone makes you feel uncomfortable, don't ignore that feeling.
One thing I've been thinking about, there's so much information about Gaskins out there. Books, articles, documentaries.
Even trading cards.
I know. It's like he's become this morbid cultural icon. And it makes you wonder, is this right? Are we exploiting the victims by making entertainment out of their suffering?
It's a valid question. Are we glorifying these killers by giving them so much attention?
I don't know the answer. On one hand, I think it's important to study these cases, try to understand them, but we have to be responsible about it.
We have to remember the victims, their families, and approach these stories with respect.
Because if we just consume true crime for the thrill of it, we become desensitized. We lose sight of the real cost, the human cost.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance.
You know, the article we keep talking about, Pee Wee Gaskins, The Prospect of a Wee Man, Lynch's Lake Historical Society and Museum, it really highlights the impact on the community, the fear, the suspicion. It didn't end when he was caught. It lingered.
The ripple effect of violence. It goes far beyond the immediate victims. It touches everyone, families, communities.
And healing takes time, if it ever truly happens.
We can't forget about the victims. We have to support them, give them the resources to heal.
Absolutely. And we have to think about the bigger picture, too. The things that contribute to this kind of violence in the first place. Poverty, lack of opportunity.
Right. We need to address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
We need to create a world where this kind of darkness doesn't have a place to thrive.
A world where these stories are just stories, not real life.
You know, it's a deeply sad story, not just for the victims and their families, but for him, too. A life consumed by darkness, by violence.
It's tempting to just label him a monster and move on, but he was a person.
And that's the hard part, right? It's easier to see evil as something outside of ourselves. But the capacity for it, it's in all of us.
Recognizing that's the first step to preventing it, to confronting our own shadows so we can choose a different path.
And I think that's a good note to end on. Remember the victims. Learn from the darkness. And let's work towards a world where these stories are just stories.